Welcome to TM News. Ireland gives warm welcome to Ukrainians fleeing conflict. Asylum seekers from elsewhere point to unequal treatment when 25-year-old Maria Kozlovskaya gazes out of the window. She sees the green fields of the west of Ireland. It's a far cry from the shelled apartment buildings of her home city of Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine. Forced into exile by conflict, the young mother has found an unlikely refuge in a 15th-century castle in County Galway. "I never dreamed that I could live in a castle in the future," she says, still in awe after 2 months of living in Ballindooley Castle with her sons, 5-year-old Ilya and 7-year-old Matvey. Down south in County Cork, 31-year-old Vera Rubin finds herself in less regal surroundings. She was one of the first Ukrainian refugees to be placed in Irish government emergency accommodation after hotel rooms ran out. The interpreter from Hostomel, near Kiev, now sleeps on a single bed inside the Green Glens Arena, an equestrian and entertainment venue in the small town of Mill Street. Although their living situations could not be more different, both women have managed to settle quickly into life in Ireland. The smooth nature of the process has prompted questions from asylum seekers fleeing conflicts in countries other than Ukraine who say they encountered an arduous asylum process that can take years to navigate. Some context: Ireland, an island of just over 5 million people, has taken in more Ukrainian refugees than many of its larger Western European neighbors. Ukrainian refugees began arriving in early March, and so far more than 30,000 refugees have arrived. Ireland gives warm welcome to Ukrainians fleeing conflict. Asylum seekers from elsewhere point to unequal treatment. County Galway and County Cork, Ireland. When 25-year-old Maria Kozlovskaya gazes out of the window, she sees the green fields of the west of Ireland. It's a far cry from the shelled apartment buildings of her home city of Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine. Forced into exile by conflict, the young mother has found an unlikely refuge in a 15th-century castle in County Galway. "I never dreamed that I could live in a castle in the future," she says, still in awe after 2 months of living in Ballindooley Castle with her sons, 5-year-old Ilya and 7-year-old Matvey. Owner Barry Hoggian, who bought the castle as a second home in 2016, was inspired to travel to Poland after watching CNN coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kozlovskaya, who traveled with Hoggian to Ireland, admits that she didn't fully grasp the scale of the castle until she arrived. Great efforts have been made to accommodate the 11 refugees who now call Ballindooley Castle home. The Grand Great Hall, once the setting for lavish banquets, now serves as a breakfast table for the young children. On a single bed inside the Green Glens Arena, an equestrian and entertainment venue in the small town of Mill Street. Although their living situations could not be more different, both women have managed to settle quickly into life in Ireland. The smooth nature of the process has prompted questions from asylum seekers fleeing conflicts in countries other than Ukraine who say they encountered an arduous asylum process that can take years to navigate. Ireland, an island of just over 5 million people, has taken in more Ukrainian refugees than many of its larger Western European neighbors. Ukrainian refugees began arriving in early March, and so far more than 30,000 refugees have arrived. Nick Henderson, chief executive of the Irish Refugee Council, an NGO providing services and support to refugees, says the government got off to a positive start by quickly invoking the Temporary Protection Directive, an exceptional measure activated by the European Union that allowed member states to waive visa requirements for refugees for up to 3 years. Ukrainian refugees have so far been mainly housed in hotels, Bandamp, BS and volunteers' homes. As the approaching tourist season looks set to create a shortage of hotel rooms, the Irish government has plans to repurpose vacant vacation homes, convents, and student halls to accommodate further arrivals. The government has not indicated how long these settings will be used to house refugees. Prime Minister Michael Martin has repeatedly pledged not to place a cap on the number of Ukrainian refugees that Ireland takes in. Roderick O'Gorman, the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, told CNN that despite it not being all the kind of the gold standard accommodation that we'd like, Ireland is doing its best to make sure Ukrainians here have security. Rubin, who decided to travel to Ireland after hearing about the welcome it offered to refugees, told CNN she didn't have any expectation regarding accommodation. The arena where she now lives has been partitioned into a series of living spaces, containing a small kitchen, living room area, and separated beds. The majority of the arena's residents, she believes, are happy to have a roof above their heads. A lot of people who came here, they left good facilities, a good life, and they're very shocked. But they don't complain, she said. In Galway, Kozlovskaya is thrilled that her sons were able to attend school within 5 days of arriving and have so far found it easy to make new friends. Not all are pleased with the Irish government's response, however. Ireland's warm welcome of Ukrainian refugees has reignited a fractious debate about its treatment of asylum seekers fleeing other conflicts in places such as Afghanistan and Syria. Over the years, the country has been repeatedly criticized for the way it deals with asylum seekers. Under its direct provision system, asylum seekers are housed in temporary accommodation as they wait to find out if they have been granted refugee status. Initially introduced as an emergency measure in 1999 in response to higher numbers of asylum applications, and subsequently formalized in 2020, the reception system has become mired in controversy in the 2 decades since. Asylum seekers have lodged many complaints about the system's lengthy processing times, substandard accommodation, and impingement on core rights including, notably, the right to work. It has drawn criticism from opposition parties, NGOs and, most significantly, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who in a 2015 report said long stays in direct provision impeded asylum seekers from integrating properly into Irish society. Frustrating system. Lucky Campbell is a former asylum seeker who came to Ireland from South Africa in 2016. He is all too familiar with the workings of the direct provision system, having spent 3 years sharing a room in a government-run facility in Cork. It took me by surprise that I could not do anything. You know, that was the frustrating thing. That I was in the system and suddenly, I could not work. I could not study. I could not make my own meals, you know. And I was just taught to be lazy, sleep and eat, sleep and eat. Every day you hope that something will happen, he told CNN. According to Unkr, an asylum seeker in Ireland can expect to wait 14 months for an initial decision on asylum status. Campbell, who co-founded the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, which campaigns for better conditions for asylum seekers, says the government's response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis has left asylum seekers from other countries feeling marginalized. With regard to the treatment of the Ukrainians, it showed that all along that the government is capable of treating us better, he said. According to Campbell, whereas asylum seekers have to wait on average 3 to 4 months to get a blue card simply identifying them, Ukrainian refugees have bypassed this step. It's not acceptable that we can as a state provide immediate supports to people at an airport when they arrive, PPS numbers, it's like our social security number. But at the same time, there's people living in Dublin for months, who don't get that same support, said Henderson, of the Irish Refugee Council. Similarly, while Ukrainian children have been enrolled quickly in Irish schools, children of asylum seekers in emergency accommodation have experienced delays in accessing school. A 2020 report from the Irish Centre for Human Rights found that children in direct provision are prevented from attending ordinary school with other non-asylum seeking children for months on end and are instead segregated in emergency education settings that are unregulated and lacking in resources. A spokesperson for the Department of Education told CNN, in Ireland, all migrant children, including children of international protection applicants, refugees, migrant workers, and unaccompanied minors, can access preschool, first and second level education in a manner similar to Irish nationals, until they have reached the age of 18 years. In Ireland, a school must admit all students applying where it is not oversubscribed and places are available. The statement also noted that schools are not required to check the residency status of refugees or other applicants seeking a school place. Kambule, we look different, we are treated different. Kambule highlights that while Ukrainian refugees were allowed to swap their driver's licenses for Irish ones, asylum seekers were legally not allowed to even drive here until a recent court judgment. The war in Ukraine caught people's attention, Henderson said, attempting to explain Ireland's change in approach. Kambule accuses the government's response of being at its core racist, saying that because Ukrainians are their neighbors, because they look like them, they treat them in that way. We look different, we are treated different, he said. CNN reached out to the Irish government for a response to Kambule's claims. A press officer for the Department of Justice told CNN that Ireland's action on the Ukrainian refugee crisis is part of an EU-wide response and in keeping with its obligations as an EU member state. Historically, when mass displacement of people has occurred as a result of violence and conflict in countries like Syria and Afghanistan, safety and shelter for people forced to flee has largely been provided to them by their closest neighbors, the press officer told CNN. She said the Department of Justice strives to have decisions on asylum applications made as soon as possible to ensure that those found to be in need of protection from the state can receive it quickly and begin rebuilding their lives. The press officer also stated that Ireland has historically provided a number of targeted protection programs to assist people fleeing conflict, referencing previous programs in response to conflict in Syria and Afghanistan. Despite the disparity in treatment, Kambule says asylum seekers in Ireland are in solidarity with what have gone through. We don't want that to happen to anyone. But we are saying, remember, the other people from other countries who also are fleeing war. Palestine, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Congo, he said. Henderson said the government's response has fundamentally created concern and raised important questions. Why aren't we able to do all the things that we've done for Ukrainian refugees and apply that to all people seeking asylum? He asked. Although Ireland is great at emergency responses, he said, the government must now think of a long-term plan for dealing with the broader refugee crisis. Back in the grandeur of Ballindooley Castle, Kozlovskaya cannot help but think of the future, too. Although she hopes that the war will end soon and she will be able to return to Ukraine, she is now sure that Ireland is really a good place for her life now. It's 7 a.m. in Kiev. Here's what you need to know: there are many dead in a Russian missile strike near Chernihiv, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He has accused Russia of a deliberate and criminal attempt to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. Here are the latest developments on the war in Ukraine. Donbas completely destroyed. Zelensky said there are constant strikes on the Odessa region, on the cities of central Ukraine, and the Donbas is completely destroyed. In the Chernihiv region north of Kiev on Thursday, Russian missiles hit the village of Desna, leaving many dead, Zelensky said. Desna is 40 miles from the border with Belarus. Mammoth U.S. aid bill. U.S. President Joe Biden will sign a $40 billion emergency aid package to Ukraine into law while he is in South Korea, an official says. The package was approved by the U.S. Senate on Thursday. The Biden administration also announced another $100 million security package for Ukraine. Food export crisis. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said he discussed ways to unblock Ukrainian food exports with his UK counterpart, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. The blockade on Ukrainian exports was also discussed by Zelensky and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson during a call Thursday. A failure to open closed ports in Ukraine to ship grain out will bring millions of people to the brink of starvation, according to the World Food Programme. Some Azovstal defenders still fighting. While hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers left the Azovstal plant in Mariupol this week, there are likely still hundreds inside the besieged complex, and they appear to include some senior commanders. Maj Bohdan Krotovic, chief of staff of the Azov regiment, suggested that he would not be surrendering, saying that the fight continues. Russia's defense ministry said over 1,700 Ukrainian soldiers have surrendered at the complex since May 16. Biden offers strong support for NATO bids. The leaders of Sweden and Finland met with U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House after they submitted their NATO membership applications on Wednesday. The Biden administration will submit reports to the U.S. Congress on the applications. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan again maintained that his country will say no to the entry. Russian forces blocking more than 1,000 cars from evacuating to Zaporizhia. Regional administration says more than 1,000 cars carrying Ukrainians have been prevented from crossing into Ukrainian-held territory in Zaporizhia, according to the regional military administration there. The administration said on Friday that cars full of people trying to evacuate were stuck at a Russian checkpoint in the city of Vasilivka. In Vasilivka, the occupiers have not allowed more than 1,000 cars to enter the territory controlled by Ukraine for the fourth day in a row, the Telegram Post read, adding that there are women and children in the cars, and that most of them no longer have money for food and water. Several cars managed to break through to the city of Zaporizhia, in southeastern Ukraine, on Thursday. Business owners of Berdyansk are forced to buy goods from Crimea, and it is necessary to sign up for an escort convoy. Such registration helps local collaborators to collect information about who returns with the goods and from whom you can later collect tribute, the regional administration said. A video posted to Telegram by the Ukrainian Government's Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security shows a long line of cars on the side of a road. Many dead following missile strike in a village in the Chernihiv region, Zelensky says in nightly address in the Chernihiv region north of Kiev. The village of Desna was hit with Russian missiles Thursday, left many dead, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address on Thursday. Desna is 40 miles from the border with Belarus. Russian strikes on Chernihiv region, in particular the terrible blow on the Desna. There is an analysis of debris, many dead, Zelensky said in his nightly address on Thursday. There are constant strikes on the Odessa region, on the cities of central Ukraine. The Donbass is completely destroyed. All this has no and cannot have any military explanation for Russia, he continued. This is a deliberate and criminal attempt to kill as many Ukrainians as possible, he said. The armed forces of Ukraine continue to advance in the liberation of the Kharkiv region, Zelensky said. In the Donbass, the occupiers are trying to increase pressure. There's hell, and that's no exaggeration. The brutal and absolutely senseless bombing of Severodonetsk. There were 12 dead and dozens wounded in just one day, he continued. The bombing and shelling of other cities, the air and missile strikes of the Russian army, all this is not just fighting during the war. This is a deliberate and criminal attempt to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. Destroy as many houses, social facilities, and enterprises as possible. This is what will qualify the genocide of the Ukrainian people and for which the occupiers will definitely be brought to justice, he added. The first trial in Ukraine against a Russian war criminal has already begun. And it will end with the full restoration of justice within the International Tribunal. I'm sure of it. We will find and bring to justice all those who give and carry out criminal orders, he concluded. The U.S.-Ukraine aid bill will be flown to Korea where Biden will sign it into law. U.S. President Joe Biden will sign the $40 billion aid package to Ukraine while he is in South Korea, an official says. The bill has to be flown to Korea for the president's signature. Biden embarked on his trip to Seoul, South Korea on Thursday afternoon. Russia's retreat from Kharkiv, another key Ukrainian city, reveals new evidence of atrocities. Sturiy Saltov, Ukraine. 2 convoys of civilian cars in one northeastern Ukrainian village speak of Russia's retreat from the area and the brutality it left behind. The first, 3 cars, laden with a priest, dogs, and troubled frowns, is headed hurriedly through the village of Sturiy Saltov from the north, fleeing the violence as Ukraine pushes Russian forces out of Rubizny. We don't even know what's happening, one driver said. We didn't stick around to find out. Ukrainian officials said this week that they continue to push towards the Russian border, liberating tiny villages on the outskirts of Kharkiv, the country's second-largest city before the invasion began. The Ukrainian advances threaten the symbolic embarrassment of expelling the Kremlin's forces back to their own border and while posing the strategic threat of cutting Russia's supply lines into Ukraine and its forces further south in the Donbas region. The advances have been swift over the past weeks. The second convoy speaks of what Ukraine has found in Russia's wake: 5 vehicles riddled with bullets, 2 torched to cinders. On May 4, Ukrainian officials have said, this convoy was trying to leave the town when it was shot up by Russian troops. The bullet holes concentrate on some of the driver's doors. Children's clothes and toys litter the area around the vehicles. Ukrainian officials said that 4 civilians, including a 13-year-old girl, were killed when Russian troops opened fire on this convoy. CNN's escorts from the Kharkiv City Territorial Defense Force say a tank shell hit one of the cars, explaining how its front section is twisted beyond recognition. Moscow says its forces don't target civilians, a claim contradicted by evidence of apparent atrocities witnessed by CNN here and elsewhere in Ukraine. A short walk up the road, out into the forest and hills nearby, are the remains of a Russian convoy. In the trees lie the remains of an armored personnel carrier, its tracks torn off by a rocket-propelled grenade, our escorts say. Sleeping bags, prayer books, grenades, and rations litter the leaves where the Russian troops slept, just outside of the village. 2 Russian corpses were found there days earlier and have since been buried. On the brow of the hill sits another, more rare piece of wreckage, the remains of a Russian T-90M tank destroyed days earlier, apparently by a Swedish-supplied Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry released a video filmed by a drone of the tank being destroyed in the apparent strike, showing the vulnerability of Russia's newest armor to NATO's hand-carried weapons. The tank's turret has been dislodged and ball bearings from its shells lie in the ashes. The Ukrainian counterattack to disrupt Russian supply lines is ongoing. Ukraine's General Staff said Friday that Russian forces did not conduct offensive operations in the Kharkiv direction. The main efforts were focused on preventing the advance of our troops in the area of the settlement of Vasil, another village less than an hour's drive from 4.Ireland in normal times. The Ukrainians have taken back a number of villages in this area east of Kharkiv. As Russian forces continue to retreat, 3 bridges in the Kharkiv region had been demolished, according to satellite imagery obtained by CNN on Friday. It seems likely that Russian units destroyed the bridges in an effort to protect their supply lines from further Ukrainian advances. Elsewhere in Kharkiv region, the Russians appear to be using artillery sporadically but with deadly effect. On Thursday, shelling of the town of Derhachi killed 2 people, according to the local administration, and destroyed the humanitarian center and medical facilities. In a village nearby 4.Ireland, locals appear less aware of the details of their occupation and liberation. One man, Victor, is at a well, filling tin buckets as there has not been electricity or water in his street for weeks. Only 3 of his neighbors remain. What calm! My heart is about to jump out of my chest, he said. Everything around is exploding. There's a hole in the garden from a shell impact. The roof was punctured by a shell, the fence is gone. It's really difficult. We sleep with our clothes on. They land nearby. There is nowhere to hide. U.S. Senate agrees $40 billion Ukraine spending bill. The U.S. Senate has voted to approve a new $40 billion bill to provide military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It is the biggest emergency aid package so far for Ukraine. The package brings the total U.S. aid delivered to Ukraine to more than $50 billion, including $6 billion for security assistance such as training, equipment, weapons, and support. The bill, which was passed by the House of Representatives with broad bipartisan support on May 10, was expected to be passed earlier this week, but was blocked by Kentucky Republican Rand Paul over a dispute about spending oversight. but the Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell dismissed these concerns and told reporters that Congress had a moral responsibility to support a sovereign democracy's self-defense. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky praised the aid package as a significant U.S. contribution to the restoration of peace and security in Ukraine, Europe, and the world. Russia likely to quickly redeploy Mariupol troops. The UK's Ministry of Defence has just issued its latest assessment of the fighting in Ukraine. It suggests as many as 1,700 Ukrainian soldiers are likely to have surrendered at the Azovstal Metal Works, the country's last pocket of resistance in Mariupol. An unknown number of troops are still inside. Once Russian forces have fully secured Mariupol, they are likely to head elsewhere in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region to reinforce other operations. But first, those soldiers will need to be re-equipped, having faced stern Ukrainian resistance, something that can be a lengthy process. However, the MA does not believe this will be done thoroughly, due to pressure on Russian commanders to quickly make gains elsewhere. Why is Russia targeting the Donbas? Russia has shifted most of the focus of its war to eastern Ukraine, after pulling back its forces from near the capital Kiev. The battle for Ukraine's old industrial heartland known as Donbas is likely to decide the fate of the Russian invasion. Donbas is predominantly Russian-speaking, and Russia has repeatedly spoken of liberating the region, home of two self-declared republics, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. Seizing the region would allow Moscow to open a land bridge along the south coast to the Russian border and control of the water supply to the Crimean Peninsula, which it annexed in 2014. Russian forces were also trying to encircle Ukraine's troops in the region. Around 40,000 of Kiev's most battle-hardened and experienced soldiers are based in the Donbas, and their loss would be a significant blow to President Volodymyr Zelensky's war effort. But in recent days, military analysts say that effort has been faltering, as Russian troops have been forced back from the city of Kharkiv towards the Russian border. Kherson to become part of Russia. New governor says the Russian-installed governor of occupied Kherson in southern Ukraine has said the region will soon be fully integrated into Russia. Volodymyr Saldo, who was installed by Russian forces after they took control of the area in early March, wrote on Telegram that it would become the Kherson region of the Russian Federation. His deputy, Kirill Stremousov, wrote that residents would be able to apply for Russian citizenship in the coming weeks when the situation stabilizes. Ukrainian officials have repeatedly warned that Moscow is planning a sham independence referendum in the region and elsewhere. However, Russian officials have not confirmed that annexation of the occupied regions of southern Ukraine is imminent, and Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said earlier this month that the future of the region depended on the will of residents. Russia has turned the Donbas into hell. Zelensky. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of turning the eastern Donbas region into hell, as intense fighting there rages on. Speaking during his nightly address from Kiev, he said Russian forces had flattened the region. Constant strikes on the Odessa region, on the cities of central Ukraine. The Donbas is completely destroyed, he said. All this has no and cannot have any military explanation for Russia, Zelensky added. This is a deliberate and criminal attempt to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. Destroy as many houses, social facilities, and enterprises as possible, the Ukrainian leader said. On Thursday, Ukraine's defense ministry accused Russia of intensifying its attacks in the Donbas and preventing civilians from fleeing. Ukraine war. One Russian's anti-war protest on the side of his shopping center. If you drive 8 hours north of Moscow, you'll come to a tiny little town called Ruskovyazotskoy. There is not a great deal to see here, apart from the chicken farm and the church that was reduced to rubble in World War II. But there is one thing in this town that is particularly eye-catching: the local shopping center. Dmitry Skurikin owns the building, and you should see what he's done to the front of it. In giant letters he's painted, "Peace to Ukraine, Freedom to Russia." In bright red paint he's listed the names of Ukrainian towns that have been attacked by the Russian army: Mariupol, Bucha, Kherson, Chernihiv, and many more. I thought this would be a good way of getting information out, Dmitry tells me. Because for the first few weeks of the war our people didn't know what was happening. They thought that some kind of special operation was being conducted to remove drug addicts from the Ukrainian government. They didn't know that Russia was shelling Ukrainian towns. Dmitry has even turned the roof of his shop into a giant yellow and blue Ukrainian flag. Suddenly, out comes a paint pot and brush and Dmitry adds more names. Borodyanka, Odessa, Irpin. The excess paint drips down the wall, blood red, making this statement all the more powerful. Dmitry knows that what he's doing is not without risk. In Russia, public protest often ends in prosecution or threats. Or both. Someone has already graffitied "traitor" on his door. And the police have been round to visit. He was later fined for discrediting the Russian armed forces. Dmitry is unrepentant. I couldn't just sit doing nothing. It would have torn me apart inside. But what I am doing is an act of desperation. Now Russians are outcasts. We deserve to be. This offensive will cast a shadow over us for a long time. The Kremlin likes to portray President Vladimir Putin as a leader who is supported by his people. The authorities insist that Russians back him on Ukraine. Dmitry claims it is an illusion. If you ask people here, are they in favor of war between Russia and Ukraine, with the shelling of towns, plus all the consequences like poverty and hunger, they would say, "Are you mad?" Dmitry tells me. Russians are being exposed to disinformation. They support the special military operation that they're being told about on TV. But people are starting to realize that what's really happening is a calamity. Outside the shopping center, I ask passers-by what they think of Dmitry's paint protest. He's an idiot. An idiot. Covering the wall with that dog's dinner, exclaims one shopper. He'd have been better off painting a picture on the wall. The next person I ask happens to be Dmitry's 87-year-old former biology teacher from school. No one wants war. I still remember World War II, says Maria Nikolovna. But it's all very well saying we don't want war. Perhaps our government knows better. He has the right to express his opinion, says a young man called Anton. And I'm worried, too, about Ukraine, because bombing a neighboring country is a strange thing to do. Dmitry Skurikin knows that paint will not bring peace. But if his protest makes people in the town stop, think, even question, then it will, he believes, have been worthwhile.